Hello and welcome to MEELive. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 4th of June, 2026. Today, a deep dive into UK policing, coverage from inside Gaza, and a spotlight on Iran. But first, the headlines. Gaza once again faced bombardment overnight. 9 people were killed and over a dozen injured. Fires erupted as Israeli strikes targeted residential towers in Gaza City. It comes as medical sources report May is on track to become the deadliest month in the enclave since the October ceasefire began. It continues a trend of intensifying violence. At least 929 Palestinians have been killed since the US brokered truce came into effect. Somaliland faces new obstacles in its divisive bid for independence. The US reaffirmed Somalia's sovereignty and territorial integrity in a move seen as a blow to Somaliland's breakaway attempts. Somaliland is an autonomous region in the country's north, and it declared independence from Somalia in 1991. But its struggles to gain any international recognition has put it on the geopolitical chessboard, including in the Middle East. Israel became the first country in the world to formally recognize Somaliland on the 26th of December last year. Somaliland then recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It hopes Israel's recognition will be followed by the UAE, Ethiopia, India, Cyprus, and Georgia. Now, finally, a number of Israeli attacks have also been reported in Lebanon, despite ongoing truce talks in Washington. On Wednesday evening, Israel and Lebanon agreed to implement a ceasefire, but said it would require complete cessation of fire by Hezbollah. It's the latest effort to revive a running truce that came into effect in mid-April. Since then, Israel has killed and wounded hundreds of Lebanese civilians and seized more of the country's southern front. On Tuesday, we spoke to Lebanese analyst Fawaz Jarjiz and Israeli journalist Gideon Levy about what lies ahead for Lebanon. You can catch up on our YouTube. For now, on with the show. To be honest, I didn't want to touch this story. The murder of a boy, just barely a man. A family's tragedy turned against their explicit wishes into race bait for the far right. Many questions need to be answered. 9 times Henry Novak told police he couldn't breathe as the 18-year-old lay dying in handcuffs in the streets of Southampton in December. We'll play the minimum you need to see. It's extremely distressing.
What's happened to you, alright?
Been stabbed.
You've been stabbed? Whereabouts? Don't think you have, mate.
Novak had been stabbed repeatedly by 23-year-old Vikram Digwa, yet when police arrived on the scene, Digwa lied about his injuries and also alleged Novak had racially abused him. Digwa is a British Sikh and has now been sentenced for life with a minimum of 21 years. Leaving the trial, Henry Novak's family said this: "We do not want his death to be used to create further division, hatred, or tension. We want his story to make our streets safer for everyone." And how dignified, how powerful is that? They said, "This is not a case about racism, this is a case about murder." So why is the conversation ripping the internet about anti-white policing and two-tier justice? Two-tier, a hashtag that first trended during the UK summer riots in 2024. It claims white people are discriminated against in the UK's justice system. It's a hashtag used again now to turn public anger into racist violence. Let me be absolutely clear. The two-tier hashtag is misinformation. Inequality in policing does exist, borne out over decades by data. But it's not white people who are being discriminated against. Black people in Britain are 7 times more likely to die after police restraint. Since its malicious construction in 2024, this hashtag has waited in the wings for convenient opportunities to turn one man's tragedy into another man's gain. Who are the culprits? Robert Jenrick, failed Tory leadership contender who then jumped ship to reform. He thinks sentencing has a blatant bias against straight white men. A reminder that last week 2 teen gang rapists made headlines when sentenced to 0 jail time. Elon Musk, a foreign tech billionaire who uses his ownership of X to claim civil war is inevitable in the UK. Tommy Robinson, a far-right former football hooligan and convicted fraudster. And of course, Nigel Farage, who was avoiding the media until now over an awkward, undisclosed £5 million gift.
We need a change in culture. Enough of anti-white prejudice. A promotion of the idea that white lives matter just as much as black lives.
Their noise distracts the public from the conversations that will actually keep streets safer. The root causes of knife crime, police training and violence. We'll start our show today by doing that before taking a deeper look at the political weaponisation. I'm very grateful we can be joined today by Leroy Logan, former police superintendent. MEELive, thank you for joining us. Now, Henry Novak's parents said, "We want his story to make our streets safer for everyone." Watching the video of Henry Novak's death in police custody, what were the main lessons for you? What did the police get wrong?
Well, I just want to say condolences to Henry Novak's family. Must be a great loss, especially with these aggravating circumstances. But in terms of how the police got it wrong, I think a lot of it actually may have started even before they got to the scene, how the report was made at the call centre and how it's dispatched to them. Now, the Independent Office for Police Conduct investigation will look into that, but I think that's one of the things that may have given the officers tunnel vision, because they were told it's a racist incident and they've approached that with a racism in mind and not looking at other possibilities. And as a result of that, they've unfortunately treated Henry as a suspect, disregarding he's in distress, of course. He's saying he can't breathe. The neighbours were actually saying he was coughing up blood earlier and there was blood on the ground. If they'd done a really proper search, they may have seen those stab wounds and seen how bad he was, instead of slapping on the handcuffs, which was insult to injury. And of course, he died hearing the officer saying you're under arrest and giving him the caution.
And prioritising life is mandated by the College of Policing guidance, and that's under the European Convention of Human Rights. So it certainly was erroneous for police to presume that Henry was guilty to the extent that they then neglected to prioritise his life. As you mentioned, race is a part of this. They arrived at the scene assuming that Henry Novak had racially abused his killer. So is the problem here, as commentators on the right are saying, that police officers are now too woke?
Now, there's a difference between bad policing and anti-racism policing. We saw an example of bad policing. Those officers not being objective, being tunnel vision around the incident, not really exploring the possibilities. And as a result of that, they went into a mode of, you're under arrest, mate, and caution him. Now, what we're seeing with certain political parties and spokespersons for those parties is that EDI or DEI training influenced them. Now, I'm saying there's no policy or regulation that has that sort of bad policing in mind. What you have are regulations and policies and advice and guidance, but it's still down to the individual officer or officers to execute it in an objective and very efficient way. Now, those officers didn't do that. So that's got nothing to do with anti-racism training. And as a result of that, we're seeing dog whistle politics being used to justify their agenda of this two-tier policing. We have gone too woke, and we have a system where it needs to be more focused on white lives matter. Well, we know all lives matter. So, and crime is crime. It has no color. We need to be an efficient and effective organization in terms of policing, and of course, those issues of two-tier policing, because it has no evidence base. There's no suggestion that there is that. So I'm going to say to Nigel Farage, listen, you're awash with money, your private donors giving you all sorts of things. Why don't you commission some research to say that you are looking at two-tier policing? So it's evidence-based. And instead of gaslighting people on these assumptions and anecdotal comments, which tends to influence people because it appeals to their ignorance and fear and buys into that populist agenda. And we just got to stop it, because Nigel Farage ignored the family to say, don't politicize my son's death. And he went ahead and did it. And his words had cause and effect, because he said it by his cold rage. Within hours, Tommy Robinson and his mob turned up at Southampton police station and then laid siege on other addresses nearby to the suspect's address, and creating community tension, especially in the Sikh community. So these things have to be nipped in the bud. We can't allow it to continue.
Yeah, and you talk about evidence-based. The latest data on this question of two-tier policing, specifically death after police handling, shows that black people are not just more likely to die, significantly more likely to die, 7 times more likely to die. So let's have that evidence-based conversation. Leroy, you were one of the founding members of the Black Police Association. You were involved in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. For anyone watching who is not familiar, this 1998 inquiry over police mishandling of the murder of 18-year-old black British student Stephen Lawrence concluded that London's Metropolitan Police Force is institutionally racist. Since then, efforts to correct this have come under repeat attacks from the same groups and individuals now peddling the two-tier hashtag. Leroy, you know the force inside and out. Can you address this question of anti-white bias in UK policing? How accurate, from your experience, is it?
It is inaccurate to the nth degree. There is no evidence to that. And for me, it's absolutely a stupid term as far as I'm concerned, because how can a majority white organization be anti-white? I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's absolutely foolishness as far as I'm concerned. And of course, there's no evidence around it. And that's why I say, Nigel, go and do some research, mate. Get your people to do some empirical research and we can have an evidence-based conversation. Until then, stop gaslighting people. You know, put up or shut up, literally. Because it's causing community tension and it's causing violence. And we are coming into the summer madness. And the last thing we want is race-based violence, because you start getting vigilante groups. And I'm not justifying any form of criminality, but people in fear do strange things. And we don't want that. And we want police to be working with the community and addressing these issues. But just to say, we still have those systemic failures, as you've said, in terms of race. Stop and search, 8 to 9 times more likely to be stopped if you're black than your white counterparts. Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, you're 20 times more likely to be stopped if you're black than you're white. So the evidence is there. Institutional racism is alive and well, I'm sad to say. But how the political reform party is driving this agenda, we are going backwards to a pre-McPherson organisation. And I don't say that lightly, but Nigel Farage is absolutely, he's executing his game plan very well to create ignorance and fear and getting people to think the police service is anti-white and it's two-tier policing. Don't get fooled, and let's call it out.
Now, the other thing that we have to talk about here is the issue of knife crime. Digwear was carrying a 21-centimetre blade. He told police officers it was part of his Sikh faith. It is not the Sikh weapon. He used it to kill Henry Novak. A lot of people are saying this is an issue about religion, but of course we have a massive issue about knife crime. How should society be tackling knife crime, especially in the wake of this killing?
Well, in a lot of ways. We've been talking about knife crime for 20 years, actually longer, 30 years. I remember when I was at Scotland Yard, we were picking up the trends of knife crime being on the increase. And we've seen how it's still the weapon of choice to create injury and take lives. I truly believe education is the key. That's why we set up our charity in the Black Police Association. It's now called Voids Youth, an independent charity. And we work with Year 9 students to know their rights and responsibilities, to work with police, to become a positive peer mentor, to know they can change their environment and not become a victim of it. We know that the public health approach, the holistic public health approach, helps young people to know the importance of their lives and how they have to contribute to other people's lives, not buy into the gangster glamour and, all of the disrespect type of agenda. So we've got to have those sort of approaches. You can't arrest your way out of this problem. You can't stop and search your way out of the problem. You've got to work with the constituent group of young people at the earliest stage, even earlier than Year 9, maybe in primary school, Year 5 and 6, to ensure that they're not getting into the mindset of carrying a knife. Because if you carry a knife, you're 4 to 5 times more likely to be a victim of it, maybe even 10 times, depends on what sort of people you're working with. And choose your friends wisely. It's so important to let young people know, don't run with the crowds that into this disrespect culture and thinking that it's glamorous to be a gangster. It's glamorous to go to school, get a good education, and be your own person. Do not be defined by social media as well. Social media is like accelerant to all this street crime, because they're organizing it in a way that you can get this mob violence. We've even seen it with shoplifting and people steaming into shops. We've seen it in large gatherings, even like the carnival. We got to train our children about getting a sense of identity from your family and your community. Don't buy into this online community where they have a skewed sense of identity. So all of these things have to be taken into account. And of course, enforcement has its time and place, but don't start harassing the same young people. You want to stop carrying the knife, you're harassing them every day of the week.
Yeah.
And having terrible impact on community tension.
Leroy, thank you so much. And while I have you, when we're on this topic of the politicisation of police, of potential racism in policing, here at Middle East Eye, it's hard not to get your view on what has been happening with the policing around the Palestine protests and the Palestine protesters. So recently, London Met Police Commissioner Mark Rowley came under fire at Middle East Eye, and this was for implying on live TV that Palestine marches would be targeting synagogues if not for police efforts. Organisers firmly denied this, pointing out none of our marches or proposed march routes has ever targeted a synagogue. Alongside this, police spent much of the past year under orders to arrest thousands of Palestine Action protesters due to a prescription ban that is now looking to be overturned. These scenes were highly controversial. Police detaining mostly elderly people, carrying signs saying, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." This came at huge cost to police reserves. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this whole episode.
Well, I think, in all honesty, police are between a rock and a hard place, because there's a lot of political pressure on policing, especially after certain racist crimes against Jewish people, even fatalities, of course, and damage to Jewish premises, even their vehicles, as we know. So there's been a lot of political lobbying and pressurizing police to do certain things that I truly believe they have to really think clearly. They're preventing marches and coming up with large risk assessments, which really you're thinking, well, you're just covering yourself just in case it goes to a judicial review, etc. I really believe if police are seen to be efficient and effective, they've got to work with a constituent group of people. Just dismissing it and not allowing peaceful assembly, which is a right of every single person, and to prevent these things is only going to cause unrest and difficulties in the long run. And we've got to work with the communities. I would like to think that common sense will prevail and they will start to reanalyze how they're working with groups and even how their classification, because there's certain classifications of terrorist groups. I mean, for me, I know there's, again, judicial reviews around these things, and we really need to get a sense of balance. But I think the political pressure that is being put on police chiefs and the commissioner is really immense. I'm not giving Mark Rowley or other chiefs, excuses, but I know they're actually having to work with the government, and the government, I think, suffering from overreach, just like how we've seen political spokespersons wanting to be involved in operational policing. And we've seen this for years, and you've got to tell them, push back, do your proper operational work, and tell the politicians, well, this is what we stand for, this is how we will conduct it, and not be politically pressurized. But we know behind the scenes a lot goes on.
Leroy Logan, thank you so much for joining me here on MEELive. Thank you. Now, I have to call myself out in that interview because I, in one question, when I was asking about whether this was an issue of knife crime or religion, I said that Digwa did not use the Sikh weapon instead of the Sikh knife. The Sikh ceremonial knife is not intended for use as a weapon, and it's certainly not inherently defined as a weapon. But you see, this is a difficult conversation that has to be had now, because Vikram Digwa claimed falsely, or at least he alleged, that Henry Novak had racially abused him. He had knocked off his turban, and this was certainly a factor in why Henry Novak was treated so criminally. This is not the only way in which Digwa weaponized his Sikh identity. He also claimed that the 21-centimeter blade he used to kill Novak was part of his faith. It was not, nor would it have been part of his faith if it had been illegally used in this way when it was the Sikh ceremonial knife. But in the wake of this, questions have arisen over knife laws in the UK, and specifically the legal exemption for knives that qualify as articles of faith. For example, the Sikh kirpan, which you can see on screen now. Under UK law, a person can possess a kirpan for religious, ceremonial, sporting or historical reasons, but like any bladed article, it can become an offensive weapon if it is used unlawfully. So to help us navigate this conversation and other conversations that have come up about faith and religion is Labour MP Jaz Athwell, chair of the all-party parliamentary group for British Sikhs. Jaz, welcome to MEELive, and thank you for being here with me today. Now, firstly, following the sentencing of Henry Novak's murder, you published a statement signed by a cross-party collective of Sikh MPs here in the UK. What was your message?
Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I think under such sad circumstances, because ultimately it is about a young lad who should have been with his family, and how you've just summed it up, that another young lad weaponized his faith and then tried to get away from the law by doing what he did. I can't even begin to process what Henry's parents would be going through. What would Henry be going through in his last few minutes of his life? And I think the message we tried to put out was that we want to be together. This is about a violent crime being committed by one person, and instead of vilifying the entire community, what we need to do is take a step back, look at what's happened, let justice be done, because the court case may be over initially. There are lots more things to be done, particularly around Digwa's family and everything else that entails that. And our job as politicians is to try and calm the situation down to ensure that we as a society live together happily, because that is the only way forward. Otherwise, we're going to start going down down the hole, really, that rabbit hole of racism, the sort of things that we used to fight long time ago, and we don't want to go there.
Now, of course, in the wake of this case, there have been riots in Southampton. Anger has been directed pretty blindly against Muslims, migrants, as well as just Sikhs. Even if it was just against Sikh, which is the only one of those categories that Digwa actually was, this would be, as you described, collective punishment, which is blindly, irrationally racist. I wonder if you saw this coming sort of as soon as that case broke, as soon as we saw the early political comments on it. And I think looking at the behaviour of politicians around you, many of whom have waded into this conversation, are you concerned about the rhetoric that you are seeing coming from some of your peers in the House?
Absolutely. And I think it's that rhetoric which really worries me. I think the problem is that politicians have been very quick to rattle off all the narratives that really stokes the fires of division. And we've had, whether it's Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage, or even Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick, even the way they sort of condemn the comments made by the leader of the Conservative Party, who actually said that all lives matter. I'm not concerned about white lives. I'm not concerned about black lives. I'm concerned about all lives. And yet that was weaponized by politicians. It really seems to me at the moment that politicians are more interested in harnessing votes out of every situation rather than actually be the grown-ups in the room who are going to take the country forward. And what we have to do is try and come to terms with that, because certainly I know politicians of yesteryear would have been working together. There's a lot that we can learn as politicians today. And I think a lot of people at the top table in a lot of the opposition parties have let themselves down, and particularly the leaderships.
And now on this question of whether or not people should be allowed to carry ceremonial knives. This is a period in our society where knife crime is frankly epidemic. And these knives, though ceremonial, can certainly be used as weapons, even if that is not their purpose. It is very important to point out here that the knife used by Digwa was actually not the Sikh ceremonial knives. But that question is now being widely asked. And I wonder what you think. Are Kirpan's Sikh ceremonial knives a potential public health risk?
Yeah, I think the Kirpan has been in existence all my life. I've seen so many people wear it. My mother used to wear it. My brother wears it. I personally don't, because I'm not a baptized Sikh. But one thing we need to be very clear about, Sikhs do not have any special license to carry knives or the Kirpan. The UK law is very clear that bladed articles can be carried for legitimate reasons, whether it's sport, work, and in this case, religious observance. And the Sikh Kirpan is recognized article of faith. And as such, it's not a license to carry it or use it as a unlawful weapon. It is something which is very central to Sikh beliefs. And certainly when a few politicians have been asked on air over the last day or so to really just show examples of where the Sikh Kirpan has been used, and nobody could come up with anything. And, you know, and I long may that continue, because as you said, even this case can't be counted as something that a Kirpan did. It was another bladed knife, which, you know, I've seen the knife and it was like horrendous. The fact that 21 centimeter knife can be carried. Now, obviously we have to look at the wider implications. Now, if you ban the Kirpan, is that going to stop any of this from happening? No, because anybody has access to any sort of knife. How many knives are we going to ban? And certainly the Sikhs who've been fighting for the recognition of the Kirpan for many years, decades. And And when they finally got it 40 years ago, and it's taken one incident which didn't even go down with the use of the kirpan, as not only that, I think in your build up at the start, not only are the Sikhs being vilified, all people of color have been vilified, and certainly the abuse I have on my X account. I only use the X account to broadcast information, but the information that comes back, I am embarrassed that there are human beings in this country or in this world who use the kind of language just to sort of, even if it was to convey my condolences to the Nowak family, which, I sincerely do as a father of 4 children. I cannot, like I said before, even begin to process what that father or mother must be going through.
Jazza Othwell, thank you so much for your time. Now, next up, we look at the political reaction. Let's return first, though, to the words of Henry Nowak's family. We do not want his death to be used to create further division, hatred, or tension. We want his story to make our streets safer for everyone. They went on, as the KC, the lawyer for the prosecution, summed up in court. This is not a case about Sikhism. This is not a case about racism. This is a case about murder. Here's how Nigel Farage responded.
Henry's family have responded to this in just the most extraordinarily dignified way. But I suggest the rest of us respond to this with pure, cold rage.
On Wednesday in Parliament, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer accused the Reform UK leader of ignoring the wishes of Nowak's family. This followed a riot on Tuesday night in Southampton when Nowak died. Crowds gave Nazi salutes while, at the same time, chanting Nowak's final words, "I can't breathe." They were led by the far-right pundit Tommy Robinson. The killer was a Sikh man, so naturally those marching shouted Islamophobic slurs.
Our nation has been invaded by people who care nothing for us, nothing for this country. Many of them bow down to the false god of Islam. This is a Christian nation.
They also called for the deportation of all migrants. Inflammatory rhetoric has come from across the right. In accelerating order, the Conservatives, Reform UK, Restore UK. After 2 years of racist rioting during the summer months, June brings fears across the UK of similar scenes, particularly among minority communities. What does this say about our political climate today? I'm joined now by journalist and expert on nationalism, Daniel Trilling. Daniel, welcome to MEELive. What do you make of the response by politicians to the case of Henry Nowak?
Well, I think, as you summarised, from across the broad right of politics, there have been efforts to exploit this case, in some cases for malicious ends. I think 2 things are going on at once, actually, at the moment. There is this broad backlash against the gains of social liberalism that blame sort of any number of ills in contemporary society on 20 or 30 years of what the right call wokeness, what they used to call political correctness back in the 80s and 90s. And there's a kind of mild version of that the mainstream right indulge in. But I think what's making a much bigger impact on politics is from the radical right and far right, an effort to rile people up around these issues, and in some cases to encourage kind of open racist resentment that, as we see, is spilling out into violence and disruption on the streets.
Now, talk to me about the role of Restore UK. This is the new sort of far-right competitor party to Reform UK. Also, their firebrand leader, Rupert Lowe. Some people saying that Farage came out, waded into this, really triggered this whole situation as part of a bid to appeal to the audience that he might lose to Restore UK. Do you agree with that analysis? Is that party going to be pushing Reform UK further to the right?
Yeah, I do agree. I think at the moment, understanding Restore Britain is actually all about the effect it's having on Nigel Farage and reform. And I think Farage's intervention this week in response to the conclusion of the trial of Henry Novak's murderer was heavily shaped by the pressure that he's now getting from even further to his right. Farage is a very skillful politician, and one of the reasons he's been so skillful and has managed to sustain a political career over so many decades is because he's historically been very good at treading the fine line between mainstream respectability and radicalism. And in previous similar occasions, he's tended to intervene with more of a nudge and a wink. So after the Southport murders in 2024, when there was lots of inflammatory rhetoric, particularly online, about the purported identity of the killer and, similar kind of calls for racist violence, Farage did intervene, but it was much more a kind of insinuation. He said, what aren't we being told by the police? This time around, he's come out and said something much more forthright, more extreme, I think. And that's because Restore Britain are now a threat to his party's dominance of the populist right, and obviously they've got this very important by-election for the the UK National Parliament coming up later this month in Makerfield, in Greater Manchester, where it's very close between Andy Burnham, the Labour candidate, and Reform's candidate, and Restore look like they're picking up a few percent of the vote, maybe as high as 7 or 8%. And actually that could make the difference between Reform winning or losing that by-election. So I think, they are having an effect on British politics now, and it's to drag the already pretty extreme populists of Reform UK further to the right.
I was going to ask about the Makerfield election and whether this was sort of part of the pre-election campaign already. I guess then, given that you brought that up, you think it probably does give us a pretty good sense of what might be coming up with those election campaigns. But that's not just with Restore Britain, thank you, and Reform UK. I mean, I'm also curious what it tells us about how Labour might behave, because right now with the government response, yes, we have seen criticism of Farage and his behaviour. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood said the police in this country have a sacred duty to police without fear or favour. Everyone is equal before the law. On policing, Starmer said there are serious questions for the police on how accusations of racism inform decision-making. What hasn't been said in response to the claims of Nigel Farage about two-tier anti-white policing? We haven't heard these Labour ministers explicitly say that two-tier policing is a myth. I'm curious, why do they refuse to address this misinformation flat out?
I think, frankly, it's cowardice, political cowardice. The Labour leadership, faced with the rise of a far-right populist party, Reform UK, over the 2 years it's been in government, have panicked, have sought to split the difference between their own position and Reform's position repeatedly, and seem to think that too strong a rhetorical challenge to the narrative propagated by Reform and the right more broadly would somehow rebound on Labour and cause them problems. And that's because, I think it's partly because they're very aware that they're losing support in key constituencies that have traditionally been part of Labour's broader electoral coalition to Reform. And it's also partly because I think they have got no strategy from confronting the very heavily right-wing dominated media in Britain. That also what they say is also almost always calibrated to stay within the boundaries that have been set for the government by the traditional right-wing press. And so I think in combination, that means that rather than using their position, highly influential position to push back convincingly against racist rhetoric and myth-making and so on, they're doing a really bad job, which is kind of encouraging it. And also the kind of underlying logic of this, well, we mustn't upset the right because we're seeking to win back voters tempted by Reform, hasn't worked on its own terms, and also has caused them even greater problems, because what's happened is that a load of disgruntled Labour voters who have socially liberal views are now splitting off and voting for the Green Party or just not voting for Labour.
No, I think you're right to bring in the media here. There's questions on media needs to answer about how it incentivizes politicians to behave. Often I think we reward politicians with headlines, not on the basis of how effective their policy making is, how much it helps people, but really how effective it is as clickbait, how much it helps the media get traffic. We have, before the media, we were talking about politicians, I suppose, people who are actually in the Houses of Parliament. We have to talk about the figure here, Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson led the Southampton protest on this topic of two-tier. Right, you talk about two-tier justice. That has been a term that is being very freely bandied about now by Nigel Farage in very direct racialised terms. It's also used by Robert Jenrick of Reform, formerly Conservatives. But as far as I understand, this term was first really developed as a trending term by Tommy Robinson during the 2024 summer riots. So here we have an example of how this fringe far-right figure, a former convict, former football hooligan, is directly shaping mainstream UK politics to really a very, very significant effect. Not just on the right, but it's also informing how Labour is behaving, as we've just discussed. How much influence does Tommy Robinson have over our mainstream political landscape today?
Well, I think Tommy Robinson is a symptom of something a bit wider, which is a large part of our political and media class are having their frame of reference set and pulled rightwards by X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, which has been taken over and reshaped by a far-right American billionaire. And, as a journalist who's used that platform a lot over the years and knows how kind of important it has been in the past, both to sort of do my reporting work, but also getting a sense of where political debate is at, understanding arguments on different sides of an issue. I'm shocked that so many people are still using it for that purpose when it has so obviously become a reservoir of hate, racism and lies, frankly. And, the way that the algorithm prioritizes certain types of content, feeds content to users that they haven't asked for and so on, and not least that Elon Musk, the platform's owner, himself personally spouts out racist and fascist rhetoric, is having a real, all of that is having a really damaging effect on the people that are there soaking it up, which includes many of the most influential people in the British political media class. And the entire environment is essentially designed to make somebody with the views and behaviour of Tommy Robinson flourish there, build up huge audiences and propagate these ideas and far-right memes and so on. And you mentioned this claim of two-tier justice that sort of started with him or with people around him and has gone into the mainstream. That's by no means the only time that's happened in the last couple of years. There's been this phrase used in British politics for the last year or so, the Boris wave, which refers to the spike in immigration that happened shortly after the pandemic in Britain. And Boris there refers to Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, and the fact that his government was elected on a promise that it would reduce overall immigration, and immigration actually went up in their term of government. Boris wave again was a phrase that started among far right extreme accounts on X, with an overtly kind of racialized connotation to it, but then was just kind of absorbed into the Westminster discourse and used not only by very right-wing MPs, but some Labour MPs as well. So I think that's the real problem underlying all of this.
Yeah, and you're so right to point out the role of Elon Musk here, especially with Tommy Robinson. Elon Musk has made it very clear Tommy Robinson is, at the moment at least, his sort of favourite of the UK bunch. He's paid his legal fees in incidents and algorithmically, potentially, given him significant favour. And I think that something that shows here is the international nature of the far-right movement, because if Elon Musk is having such a direct influence, well, that is what we would classify as foreign interference in a democracy, in UK democracy. this issue that this episode is about, the murder of Henry Novak, his death in police custody in Southampton. This appears to be a very local issue about which these rioters were protesting. But this is not a local movement, is it?
No, absolutely not. And I mean, this has been the big change in far right and right wing nationalist politics over the past decade or so, which it has become a movement that exists internationally, online and offline, and things that happen in one country have knock-on effects elsewhere. You know, people committed to that movement can share ideas and resources in a way that they weren't able to before. But I think crucially, and this seems to be a particular issue for the UK, an event in one country can become a rallying point for the whole international far right loose movement that is interested in it. And this happens again and again with Britain, I think, because Britain has kind of become symbolic to far right nationalists and white supremacists and so on, as they see it, a symbol of everything that is wrong with multiculturalism and liberal immigration policies and left-leaning liberal elites and so on. And I mean, it's based on myths and lies. You know, one of the key images that has been very prominent in the far-right global imagination, for example, is of London as this crime-ridden hellhole where the crime is perpetrated by immigrants and Muslims and people from ethnic minority communities. That's been going on for a decade. I mean, and it's for someone from London, I find it very surreal, because obviously that's how bits of the UK right-wing press have portrayed London for years and years, and you've kind of got used to that being, oh, okay, fine, they're sort of doing it and they put it in their newspaper and so on, and then suddenly it's like these people on the other side of the world are doing it as well, not least Donald Trump when he was active on Twitter during his first term as president. And as this has kind of grown, there's been this kind of feedback loop where then that itself, you know, what Elon Musk pumps out about London and the UK and so on, then is fed back into the minds of people here in the UK who absorb this stuff on social media and pick up the ideas, and that in turn spills out onto the streets. So it's a very dangerous dynamic, I think.
Daniel Trilling, thank you so much for joining me here on MEELive. Now we'll head on shortly to Iran, but we shouldn't lose sight of the other front in the regional conflict. Since Iran launched its war on Gaza, over 10,000 children have suffered life-altering injuries, including amputations, severe burns, and spinal and brain injuries. But a new clinic in Gaza is treating burns patients using 3D-printed physiotherapy face masks. These help prevent permanent scarring and future complications. MEE visited the 3D clinic to shine a light on how Palestinians are rebuilding from within.
حروق عميقة من الدرجة الثالثة في وجهه وصدره ورجليه. الحمد لله محمد عدى مرحلة الحروق، بعدها بدأ يظهر عنده نسيج وحشي، كان وجهه أسوأ من هيك، والحمد لله عملنا له قناع بلاستيكي بأطباء الحدود، والحمد لله تحسن، بدأ شوي شوي يتحسن عليه.
We started this project in 2020 in order to provide a special kind of rehabilitations for the patients who are suffering from the scar formation in the face or the neck. Medically and usually when the patient when suffering of the deep burns in the face or the neck, they are suspected of some complication to be developed in their scars. So our goals is to provide the pressure therapy on the patient who has suffering of scar formations or contracture on the face. The aim is to provide the pressure therapy by to use the 3D technology to design the orthosis of the patients, face orthosis of the patients, to apply the pressures, to be more fit and to get more accurate results in the patient outcome.
محمد له تقريبا 10 شهور بيلبس القناع البلاستيكي، كان في عنده هنا نسيج وحشي وهنا وتحت هنا كان كتير بارز عن وجهه يعني، والحمد لله بدأ ينضغط ويتحسن. مبسوطة كتير إنه ابني بدأ يتعالج ويتعافى.
We are currently working with our availability of the human resources, of our equipment and materials, but recently we faced some challenges of shortage of some materials, like the filaments of the printing, like chips, powders to prepare the patient's tattoo. We currently used some alternative methods as a traditional of the pressure garments to compensate or to cover the shortage of these materials after the war. We receive every day, we have at least 5 patients to follow up for the modification or the assessment or the new interventions with this kind of the rehabilitations. We have a lot of the patients improve. We have most of them are children. We success also to prevent the complications, the further complications that may be developed in the patient face by our intervention of the face mask.
Here are the updates on the US-Iran war. For one thing, apparently it's no longer a war. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified to Congress that Operation Epic Fury had been wound down entirely. He said he would not call the current exchanges of fire with Iran a war. So what are those exchanges of fire? Clashes continue in the Strait of Hormuz, where both sides are imposing blockades. On Tuesday, the US military struck a Botswana-flagged oil tanker headed for Iran's Karg Island. Iran said it targeted a US vessel on Wednesday. US Central Command denied the attack. The Gulf was then hit with renewed attacks. One person was killed and over 60 injured in Iranian drone strikes on Kuwait's international airport. The airport also sustained significant damage, though Iran blamed this on a US missile interceptor gone wrong. The US denied this. Kuwait has been a frequent target for Tehran, which claims that the Gulf country has been used as a launch pad for US missiles heading its way. Kuwait maintains it has not allowed Washington to use its basis for this war. Bahrain, Jordan, Iraq, the UAE and Qatar also suffered Iranian fire. But while hostilities appear to be escalating again, Iran has acknowledged that it's back at the negotiating table with the US. This followed earlier threats of walking away over Israel's relentless bombardment of Lebanon. Trump, once more, said significant progress had been made in negotiations. Iran's foreign minister once more denied this. So here to make things make sense is Trita Parsi, Iranian analyst and vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, welcome back to MEELive. Lots to discuss. First, attacks on the Gulf. Iran's definition of proportional retaliation appears to be shifting. The US struck a tanker near Karg Island. Iran struck Kuwait, also Bahrain, Jordan, northern Iraq, the UAE, Qatar. What happened to tit for tat?
Yeah, the Iranians have announced a new formula for tit for tat, in which they're saying that now for every tit, they will respond with 1.5 tats, essentially. They will respond 1.5 times the force of whatever the US uses against Iran. What I think happened here is that about 8 or 9 days ago, the United States started to strike at Iranian ships, and then also on the Iranian mainland, particularly in the Bandar Abbas area. And this is part of, I think, both as tightening of the blockade and escalation of it, as well as putting pressure on the Iranians to give a response back to Trump on the proposal that was on the table, that the Qataris in particular have played a very critical role mediating. There's deep frustration on the American side that the Iranians were so slow in responding, and to the best of my knowledge, they have not given a full response even yet. At first, the Iranians responded proportionately, But I think they quickly realized that that level of exchange between the US and Iran is to the benefit of the United States. It would normalize the idea that within this ceasefire, the United States can strike at Iranian ships and the Iranians could strike back at some of the GCC countries, but it would not impose much of a cost on the US. And it would be a new normal, erode Iran's deterrence, and it would be quite beneficial to the United States. So 2 days ago, apparently, they shifted. They tried to change the equation. Suddenly, as you mentioned, they struck Kuwait, Bahrain, several other countries at the same time. And I think this was their way of saying they still have escalation dominance and they're not going to tolerate a lower level of exchange. The reason for that is very interesting. The US and Iran would both be comfortable with some form of a deal. I think both of them are serious. Obviously, they have very different ideas of what the deal should be. But short of a deal, they have different comfort levels in terms of where this ceasefire would be. The US side, as I mentioned, would be benefiting from a lower level exchange that doesn't ruin the ceasefire, but tightens the blockade of the blockade. That's very uncomfortable for the Iranians, who are already now starting to suffer with much lower oil sales as a result of that blockade. However, the Iranians are comfortable, not delightful, I would say, but they're comfortable with a far greater escalation in which they can actually inflict far more damage on the global economy and on the United States, whereas the United States is not at all comfortable with that level of escalation. And what we saw here was that the Iranians were saying, we're not going to tolerate your level of escalation, we're going to increase it because we know that you're going to be uncomfortable with that. So either we both de-escalate or there's going to be a full escalation. It will be interesting to see what the American response will be to that. What we've seen so far is that the Trump administration and Trump himself has played down the Iranian escalation. And that seems to be something he says in order to reduce pressure on himself having to respond to this. So we may see a de-escalation. It may also be just a tactical pause in which the US is regrouping and trying to determine how to take its next step. And next step may actually be a further escalation. It's unclear at this point, but the early signals from the Trump administration at least seems to appear to have paved the way for a mutual step down from this.
And the context of Trump's reaction here is that in the US, the House of Representatives has just voted in favor of measures to halt the war on Iran. 4 Republicans joined Democrats in a rare rebuke of the president. This, of course, however, may be largely symbolic. Does this matter? Is this playing in to that negotiation?
It absolutely matters. Even if this resolution at the end of the day does not tie Trump's hands legally, formally, it nevertheless shows that the patience on the Republican side supporting this war, or a lukewarm support of this war, despite the fact that no end is near, despite the fact that midterms are going to be a bloodbath for many of these Republicans. It means that now we're gotten into a territory in which enough of them are defecting to allow this to pass. Even if it doesn't formally hold Trump's hands, it's a very strong indication of how patience is running out. And this is a major political problem for Trump, despite the fact that he keeps on saying that he doesn't care about these things. That's what he has to say because he doesn't want the Iranians to think that this should embolden their position. But reality is he has to care about this issue.
Now, we keep hearing that Iran is in a stronger negotiating position today than it used to be. You talk about their escalatory power. They've certainly gained leverage in Hormuz. But as you just pointed out, this is also very, very economically devastating for Iran. And it's important to remember that before the war even began, there were mass protests triggered initially over dire economic conditions. The war is certainly protracting this. Can you bring us any update of the political and economic sentiment inside Iran? And does that damage Iran's strength at the negotiating table?
It absolutely damages Iran's strength more than anything else because it shows that Iran does not have infinite time. It was in a very dire economic situation before the war. In the first phases of the war, its economic situation in some ways improved because it sold more oil than before at a much higher price without any major discounts. But now those oil sales have gone down significantly as a result of the blockade of the blockade. But here's the problem with the blockade of the blockade. Like all other sanctions measures that the United States has imposed, the US, first of all, overestimated how quickly it would have an effect on Iran. So there was this talk that within 10 days, the Iranian economy is going to crash, all of these things. I mean, essentially, Iran's economy should have crashed a month ago, according to these estimates. Completely overestimated it. But secondly, it's also misunderstanding what Iran's response would be. Thinking that this would force the Iranians to capitulate, instead we see exactly what the response was going to be, which was always clear. If the Iranians were pushed into a corner, they would escalate in turn. And that's exactly what we saw 48 hours ago. It's that all of these things are coming together. As I mentioned earlier on, this was an effort by the US to intensify the blockade. The blockade is having an impact on the Iranian economy, and the Iranian response is to escalate in turn, not to capitulate. And this is a pattern we've seen for more than 25 years, in which the US constantly thinks that its escalatory moves are going to be some sort of a game changer that forces Iran to capitulate, and none of them have so far proven to be that. But it does mean Iran does not have an infinite amount of time. It also means it's very important for the Iranians to get an end to the war in a manner that enables them to manage the internal situation afterwards. If they don't have sanctions relief, if they don't get a lot of release of their own funds right away, they're going to have challenges managing the internal situation, because right now the population, as a result of the war, is not expressing or manifesting their opposition through protests, etc. But once the war is over, it's very likely to go back to that, given how bad the economic situation is. So I think from the Iranian standpoint, it's a security issue for them to get as much of their frozen assets released as quickly as possible during the stage of the MOU.
And Trita, we're keen for your thoughts on this comment from Donald Trump when asked about Iran's new supreme leader.
Would you like to meet him or meet any of the Iranians in person?
I've never thought of it, actually. It's a very good question. I'll think of it. Yeah, I'd like to meet him. I like to meet everybody. I'd like to meet him. We probably will meet at some point.
Now, Mojtaba Khamenei has not been seen in public since US-Israeli airstrikes at the start of the war killed his father, mother, wife, sister, and left him injured. Do you see Khamenei taking Trump up on this offer someday?
I find it extremely unlikely that there ever will be such a meeting between Mojtaba Khamenei and Trump. I'm not surprised at all that Trump is willing to meet. He's made it very clear, unlike previous presidents that allowed political constraints to diminish their ability to directly engage with foreign leaders, even the ones that they deeply despise or disliked. Trump has not been like that. He's met with Shara, he's met with Kim Jong-un. He has none of these different problems. And in fact, the conversations between the United States and Russia dramatically increased once he came into office, because he didn't have a problem talking to Putin, unlike Biden. But I don't think the Iranians will respond in that manner of having Mojtaba meet with him. However, I find it quite likely that at some point there is a meeting, and even a public meeting, if there is a deal between a senior Iranian official and a senior American official, and it might be Trump himself, but it won't be Mojtaba Khamenei on the Iranian side.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for your time. And that brings today's MEELive to a close. To all of you watching, thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email meelive@middleeasteye.net. I'll be here live at 5 every Tuesday and Thursday, noon if you're in New York. See you then.